This is Speaking of Shakespeare, conversations about things Shakespearean. I'm Thomas Dabbs, broadcasting from Aoyama Gakuin University in central Tokyo. If you are joining us on YouTube and wish to listen to this program as a podcast, you may click the link below to your favorite podcast platform. This talk is with James Shapiro, professor in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. Jim serves on the board of directors of the Royal Shakespeare Company, and in 2011 was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. We will begin our talk today with his recent book entitled Shakespeare in a Divided America. This series is funded with institutional support from Aoyama Gakuin University and also with a generous grant from the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. Well, Jim, there you are. Then thank you so much. And thank you so much for joining us. My colleagues in Japan, here in Japan, internationally, in theater, literary, linguistic, cultural studies, just people who are interested in Shakespeare and also things American in this case. They're all going to be super grateful. And we, of course, are asking many non-Americans to give us leeway to talk about things American. You and I are both Americans, both from very different backgrounds, actually, but both sons of the Republic and the great American experiment. When I first saw the title, Shakespeare in a Divided America, I thought, oh no, James Shapiro has jumped into the whole Trump thing, social media, cable news, hornet's nest with Shakespeare in hand. And I was really relieved to see the subtitle concerning our past and our future. And there's a bit of that stuff at the end, and rightfully so, but I was pleased to find that it started with John Quincy Adams, one of the heroes of the Armistice. But then I was disheartened as it continued with the paradox present within his soul concerning Othello and race. So my relief was short-lived. And when I was reminded via Shakespeare that division has been with us as Americans since the beginning, and the very Shakespearean poetic element of paradox also I kind of want to ask you about. You show how Shakespeare at once reflects conflicts in American consciousness, but has also driven the minds of American influencers, including presidents and a notable assassin. May we ask you to give us an overview of your book?
Sure. I should say that those, including yourself, familiar with my work, know that I have focused, at least for the previous quarter century, on 2 years in Shakespeare's life and in Elizabethan and Jacobean England. And I thought the furthest afield I would ever get from Elizabethan England was Jacobean England. I'd go as far as 1606, but that's as far as I would really trespass.
The year of Lear, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And those two books took me, the first one took 15 years to research and write. And the internet made it a little faster. So the year of Lear just took me a decade to research and to write. So had you asked me back when I was researching and writing those books, would you write about Shakespeare in America? My answer would be, in all honesty, I know precious little about America. And Shakespeareans tend not to write about America. They tend to write about the Anglo-American context. If it's global, they would look to Japan before they'd write about America. My first publication for Shakespeare Quarterly, and the only time I published in that extraordinary journal, was a short piece on Hamlet in Tokyo. So that's as far afield as I would get. But in 2016, when Hillary Clinton was defeated and Donald Trump was elected president, I realized I didn't really understand what was going on in my own country, and that I had a much better sense of what was going on in 1599 than in 2016. And a few years before this, I had put together an anthology for the Library of America on Shakespeare in America. And that gave me a stepping stone to start thinking about what was going on in America through the only focusing lens I know, which is Shakespeare. And it may not be the best focusing lens, but it's the only one I know. And it meant touring a bit, going to the South, which I've lectured in the South, but serious visits to Tennessee and Florida and Texas and a couple of other states, just to try to understand how Shakespeare was understood there and was valued there. And then I just do what I usually do, which is go into archives, and thought hard about an arc that began, as you say, with the founding fathers and took us up to the year of publication. And I didn't want to write a survey. A really wonderful survey of Shakespeare in America was published by Alden and Virginia Vaughn, who are friends, and I admire that book enormously. I wanted to do what I ordinarily do in my work, which is choose a year or choose a series of years and then drill down and see if I could really understand a specific historical moment and how a particular Shakespeare production or adaptation or conflict might help explain something about America's past, so that I could see where we came from. And again, as you rightly noted, where we might be heading, because that is as crucial, although more difficult to speculate about. But I thought if I established a trajectory that took me from the 1830s to 2017, I might be able to say something about where we are heading.
Yeah, well, I was struck right off the bat with the idea of J.Q. Adams being so ardently against interracial marriage and taking it out on the play, which of course, even in his time, was a kind of ancient play, but he took it as contemporary, as personal, and then we're transported into Corpus Christi, Texas, with Ulysses S. Grant in drag playing Desdemona. And I didn't know this. I've read a little on the subject, but I didn't know these things, and it were enlightening.
I certainly didn't know them when I began. I revere John Quincy Adams as a fierce abolitionist, sixth president of the United States, a man who went back into the House of Representatives to fight slavery after he left the presidency. So I have enormous respect for him, and always have and still do. And yet he exemplified something that I discovered again and again in researching and writing Shakespeare in a Divided America, which is there are things people will say about Shakespeare or through Shakespeare that they won't say in any other way. So John Quincy Adams has left a record of tens of thousands of pages of diaries and other kinds of writings, and he nowhere in them mentions miscegenation, or as he would have called it, amalgamation. The only time he did so was in two essays on Othello. And I realized that there's a kind of unwritten history of America that can be unpacked if you look at what people say about Shakespeare or live through Shakespeare. You gave the example of Ulysses S. Grant as a member of the 4,000 strong U.S. Army about to invade Mexico and extend the reach of slavery. And there he is rehearsing the role of Desdemona. And if you ask me what my kind of takeaway on that is, I think it's extraordinary that a man who led the Union forces not that long after in the Civil War, who would become president himself, saw the world through the eyes of a woman. He's wearing a dress, and Longstreet, his foe in the Civil War, said he looked really good in a dress. Grant saw the world through the eyes of a woman in love with a Black man. And I think that is a great thing for a United States president to do, any United States president.
Yeah, to transport himself into that world, But the interesting thing also that you remark upon is the choice of Othello in this basically expansionism that included slavery and an expansionism that was trying to expand slavery into what now is Texas proper, and that this would be the play of choice in some way.
You know, we in the academic world right now, the preoccupations, rightly so, are about race. But when Grant and his fellow officers put on Othello, I'm sure they were thinking of this as a play about military culture and military life.
Yeah.
And there are many, many, many Americans who serve in the military who will understand the issues that Iago struggles with, of promotion, of being passed over. And I think race mattered less to these soldiers than an army play. And Othello is an army play. There's no question about that.
And the question comes up right off the bat among my peers sometimes, why Shakespeare in America? Now, my answer has been, well, if you read any history of the 13 colonies, and as I have, I'm from South Carolina, I've read history, they're fascinating, all of them. But you're disappointed at the beginning to find out you have to go through 100 to 150 pages worth of what happened before the 1776 and all of this stuff. And it has to do with indigenous peoples, native tribes, the relationship between colonists who were subjects of the crown. And so it's perfectly natural that they viewed themselves as English, and reading Shakespeare as well as Milton or the Bible or anything would have been very strongly ingrained before even the Revolution. So it doesn't seem to me that curious that Shakespeare, just became part of the American experience.
I agree. And I think about the ways in which Shakespeare's poetry is written at the same time that the King James Bible, that so shaped the language and rhetoric and belief systems of so many Americans in the 17th and 18th centuries, early colonization. So it's no surprise until you get to post 1776, when it looks like America will want to find its own literary heroes rather than accept those handed down from the nation they've broken with. And that turns out not to be the case, to Melville's chagrin, probably to many others. Shakespeare remains, I didn't know this when I began the book, but he's the only author in the Common Core that is specified as someone whose work should be taught to high school students in America today. And his works are taught to 90% or so of American high school students. So reports of his death are greatly exaggerated.
Well, it's also very good stuff, let's admit, but I think in the States, it was kind of slow to develop a literary tradition that was received well in the States. In fact, if my memory serves, some of the great writers, Longfellow and Whitman, first enjoyed receptions in France or in England, and then the Americans found out, oh, we have our own people too. But it was slow in coming. What was not slow in coming was a sense of partisan nationalism that in your book culminates. It probably was there before, and well, I'm sure it was there before, but in the Astor Place Riots. And I do remember an old book now, and I wish I could remember the author, but it was issued by the Folger Library called Shakespeare in America. And I came across it years ago, and I read about that incident for the first time. And I'm going, I want to know so much more about this. And you told us so much more about it.
It was a fun story to tell. One of the challenges in writing this book was each episode that I wrote about, especially Astor Place and Abraham Lincoln and his assassin, John Wilkes Booth, they wanted to be books. And every day I'd go to the computer and fight and trim and cut because I needed to contain multitudes in this book, and it couldn't swell out of shape. But the Astor Place riots in my native New York continue to haunt me. My students are really engaged by it, whether it's about income inequality, nationalism, class conflict, immigration, maybe even a bit of racism thrown into the mix. It's a hard story to untangle, and yet it's the first time blood is shed over Shakespeare in a serious way in the world. And 20 people were killed, a couple of hundred were injured over a production of Macbeth, if you can imagine that.
Out of airy nothing, I think in the Prince says in Romeo and Juliet that, here, when it gets started, how quickly people can become unhinged in a mob situation. And of course, in a time in New York City when you didn't have, I don't think you had a professional trained constabulary. I think they had to bring in the National Guard with their rifles to start shooting into the crowd.
They did. They brought in the state militia. And in fact, you're right. One of the results of the Astor Place riots was the establishment of the New York police force. The NYPD came out of that. And also the creation of Central Park, because civic leaders understood there's too much pressure building up in this urban environment. We need to give people a release, and a night at the theater is insufficient in that regard.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm thinking it may be later when you have the scenes that we remember. It was Daniel Day-Lewis from Gangs of New York,
yes,
and the boys of the Bowery, and those tough guys coming in from their meat butchering shops or whatnot, from who also went to theater. And
yes, they did.
Yeah.
Not much later than this, in fact, and that's part of the roiling gangs and divisions between communities in downtown Manhattan in the 19th century. Lots of rioting.
Yeah. Well, I was really impressed. Well, let's pause a little bit with Lincoln, because that connection with the Booth family, and that how they were in themselves, even before the assassination, part of a large part of American theater history. And from what I know, the father was Edwin Booth. Is that right?
Father was Junius.
Junius
Edwin was
Brutus.
the eldest
Junius
brother.
Brutus Booth. What
Yes.
a name. Junius Brutus Booth. Edwin Booth was the brother. And this conflict had to do with bringing Macready over, a famous British actor, who wasn't, he wasn't a member of the House of Lords. He was a regular guy who had his own class struggles in England, I think, like any actor did at that time. But he was famous enough to go on the Great American Tour that I think that people don't know about, that this may begin in New York, but it goes to DC, it goes to Nashville, and maybe St. Louis. There's a theater in Charleston, South Carolina, certainly New Orleans, but they would tour America and gain traction and fame. And he was competing against Forrest, who was his American counterpart, who would have been like, I don't know if you talk about two Oliviers or two, and they took this competition something like your British hooligans, in terms of, which team you're on.
It's, we forget a lot of our cultural history in America. The superstar performers in the 19th century were Shakespeare actors, Charlotte Cushman, and imported heroes like Macready. Edwin Forrest is the first great American male Shakespearean. And every small, mid-sized, and large town and city in America had theaters, and they would go from theater to theater. And when Macready went to Cincinnati, somebody threw half of a sheep's carcass on stage to protest his performance. There you go.
Forget these polite crowds, who wait to the very end. This was raucous stuff, and there was theater within theater.
Absolutely.
The observation, you see it in Hamlet, but then later, who's there in society, and this is we're getting into Edith Wharton's New York. There's high society. There are people in the book of high society who are approved, and they have their various places along the side and their privileged seats. And then you have the pit down there with all these people, and a lot of people observing how someone else reacts to a particular scene, that kind of stuff going on. It just must have been something.
It was more like a prize fight than, we think of theater where people politely applaud at the end. If you applaud in the middle of it, people give you a dirty look. People are throwing pennies and oranges and rotten fruit, and there's prostitution going on in the upper level. I mean, it was a three-ring circus. That's what theater was in the 19th century.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think also in Covent Garden, in what now?
Absolutely. Yes.
West End. And that kind of stuff. And these actors, some of them, I'm trying to remember if it was, I don't know if it was Keane, but there was one actor who famously would just play Lear drunk in one of the things I read. And there are things you had to leave out. I imagine that you probably feel that you had to leave out 90%. There's a situation where a sentry shoots Othello because he gets so involved in the play, and I can't remember the source, but they're just story after story of things that just are amazing that happened during these performances.
Well, one of the pleasures of my life is when I'm not teaching Shakespeare at Columbia, I'm working with the public theater, either in summer productions at the Delacorte in Central Park, but more often than that, taking professional actors on tour with 90-minute versions of the plays to prisons and halfway houses around New York. And the first time I went to Rikers prison, they didn't know they were supposed to sit on their hands and clap politely. And we were doing Much Ado, and hero faints and six guys jump up, she's down, she's down. And much else besides. Going to the women's prison in Westchester when Romeo doesn't avenge himself on Tybalt. He was getting some nasty stuff thrown his way. When he came back and killed Tybalt, it was to universal relief in this crowd. So I love prison Shakespeare because it's much closer to an Elizabethan and 19th century experience than it is to our overly polite modern day theater.
Yeah, when I was in graduate school, I had the experience of teaching in maximum security prison. Oof. And well, I didn't do it long because it was afterwards I would be drained in the sense of because these were smart people, and they had passed tests to take a college level class, and I was a grad student. And I did the waste of resources, of human resources that I felt, and also a strong, well, I came away with two things: that number one, there are people in prison who don't need to be there. And number two, there are some people who do. We're happy that they are there.
Which prison was this?
This was Kirkland Correctional Institute in Columbia, South Carolina. So and it's
heavy duty.
Heavy duty, and primarily African American. Part of that history of, well, let's see if we can somehow detain African American men somehow. And yet there were two young white guys in there, about 19 years old, and both were in due to these idiotic legislative moves, not just in South Carolina, but in other states, to supersede judges and their judgment. So it was a 3 strikes and you're out. And I checked the records. I had someone who was a friend in the office and checked the records. 2 busts for marijuana and 1 bust for small amounts of cocaine, but enough to get them 20 years locked down, no parole. And those two boys were in there. And there was a gentleman in there who looked, I swear, just like Morgan Freeman in Shawshank. And same kind of personality, like he goes, I'm not sure what I would do if I got out now. But he killed a man 25 years earlier, drunk, maybe on drugs, in a bar fight. And he said, if I had lost, he would be here and I'd be in the ground. But I saw no reason to, have him detained. He was a mild, peaceful soul, as were several other people there. But
when I think about prison inmates. Shakespeare's plays are filled with murder, with violence, with a lot of unspeakable things that you and I in our daily lives don't have much contact with.
Yeah.
Broken families, the whole nature of so many of these plays. And one of the most rewarding things is bringing plays to audiences that know from experience what these plays are about.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's I think I was attracted to that, but from Jean Genet, was kind of famous for his prison performances. And early when I was in college, I studied. I did a foreign study at University of London, and just took in, a country boy finally getting into the West End. And every day you can do a matinee and an evening performance. You can get these cheap tickets, and it's just this infectious thing. You fall in love with it so immediately. And one of the productions I saw was the San Quentin Players.
Oh, great.
Directed by Beckett himself, in a burned out kind of theater,
Wow.
Tottenham Court Road. And
Wow.
I never will forget that production. I've never seen Beckett. I've seen the Endgame maybe 2 times before that, and it was done in a jocular fashion. You can do it that way. But the pain that was transferred from those actors to the audience, it was so dark, but it was so good.
Well, you're very lucky to have seen that. And the
Yeah.
San Quentin experiment in Shakespeare and in Beckett is unmatched. Really, it's
Yeah.
extraordinary.
Yeah, that he managed to do that. That's just amazing, that would happen. And but let's move on a little bit. I want to go up to Henry Cabot Lodge. He kind of interests me on the subject of paradox. Someone who at once was pro-immigration, then turned strongly against it, had Shakespearean justifications, it seems, from the Tempest or whatnot, similar to John Quincy Adams, who had his reasons to support abolition, but then very privately felt that white people and Black people should not procreate. That paradox, which is in Shakespearean sonnets or whatever, is playing with that notion. But Henry Cabot Lodge, and a brilliant man in his writing.
These are extraordinary intellects. And one of the things that I didn't want to do was write a book in which all the heroes were Northerners and all the villains from the South, a kind of Mason-Dixon or East-West divide, or even liberal and conservative, because John Quincy Adams was, by anybody's standards of the day, on the liberal end of the spectrum. So it's not as if I was going after any individual or group in this. What I was trying to say was that individuals gravitate to Shakespeare for different reasons. And Lodge, one of the towering intellects in the Senate at the turn of the century, decided to make immigration his issue. And he used Shakespeare as a stick to beat immigration with. And he was relentless. And the result was the 1924 restrictions on immigration in this country, only overturned in the 1960s. And right now we're in the midst of a crisis over immigration. So none of these issues go away. And Shakespeare again and again is mobilized, sometimes weaponized by the left and the right, in dealing with the things that Americans are really not good at talking to each other about and of working through communally and collectively.
Yeah. Yeah, as I get older and look back over the Jim Crow South that I grew up in, it was still that way. But then schools were desegregated, and things that there wasn't the type of violence or fighting that you would imagine, because we were kids. This was our time in that school, and we knew we had to mediate these conflicts. There were friendships that were limited because of the continuing inability for anyone to go to anybody else's home and that kind of thing. But I've always thought, if you had a Geiger counter, a racist Geiger counter, and passed it over America, there probably would be upticks, maybe even now, in the South. It might be surprising. It might be very high. It might not be that high at all. But anywhere you passed it over, in recent history, the problems with policemen not shooting shooting kids or whatnot, or arresting for no reason. These are happening all over the country.
Right. And I live in New York City, one of the liberal bastions of this country, and our Department of Education is among the most segregated in the country, hands down.
Yeah.
So these issues, and again, the Shakespearean connections to these issues run throughout the whole country. It's not one community or another. It's not high culture or low culture. It's Shakespeare on film. It's Shakespeare in musicals. Everywhere we turn, we watch as people try to confront and resolve differences really through Shakespeare, which I find thrilling.
Well, the Tempest, and getting back to Henry Cabot Lodge and that movement to appropriate the Tempest, recently, I think it was in Arizona, the Tempest, or there was a move to ban it from education because some of our colleagues in post-colonial studies found it a play to use to enlighten people to the ideas of post-colonial thinking and very progressive left thinking. And it was used for the opposite reason during that time, that the same play was used to do two different things, quite different on the political spectrum.
That's what I love about Shakespeare, that a play that's now taught as the anti-colonial or exposing colonialism, Tempest, was in 1916, in the midst of these battles over immigration, used to as a means of encouraging the education and assimilation of the immigrants who was streaming into America. So the history of productions is endlessly fascinating. And I'm still working on these issues, even having published that book.
Yeah. And the introduction not only of white superiority against slaves or freed slaves or blacks, then you add, there's a whole smorgasbord that would be Italian immigrants from southern Italy, as you pointed out, and any other kinds of Eastern European.
And my unwashed ancestors from Eastern Europe, Jews born into the
anti-Semitism, which is a strong theme in your writing and other books. You steer straight into that. And I remember years ago reading your, we might get to this in a bit, but reading your
Shakespeare and the Jews.
Yeah. And your apologia at the very beginning saying, I just did not want to go into this. And it reminded me a little bit of Hector and Troilus and Cressida. There are all of these reasons not to go into it. Okay, so here I go. And let's just do it. It needs to be done. And moving up to the shrew, and the shrew is very recently back, very strong. People want to do it because it's a great play and it has some great things in it. But the way of for Kate to manage the ending in the speech and that sort of, and whether or not kiss me, Kate, whether there is a kiss or not a kiss, that sort of thing with Shakespeareans and production. There's a recent virtual reality version of it. I interviewed David McGinnis and another guy named Steve Wittick at Carnegie Mellon, and they put together, Steve Wittick had the technology to do a kind of 360 virtual reality version, which is very interesting, but then handling what we hope is post sexist, it isn't, but what we're aiming to. And then those issues were there. And in post-war America, that's when that's the rub, isn't it? Getting back, and those women have been working in factories. They know they can work. They know they can bring home a paycheck, and to suddenly surrender all of that to these guys coming back from the war. That
one day you're told be Rosie the Riveter, and the next day you're told be a submissive wife and quit your job so a veteran coming home from the war can have it. And that was the great background to Kiss Me, Kate. And it was just fun delving into that moment of mid-century history that, again, I knew precious little about, and looking at the ways in which Bella Spivak, who wrote the book for this extraordinary musical, was herself struggling with these issues in her personal life. So I don't think I've ever had as much fun researching a book because there was so much I did not know. And throwing myself into these stories was great fun, like rolling around in the snow like a kid.
Well, I'm going to move a little bit more quickly and get up to the LGBTQ bit and how you integrated that with the vexing issue of how to change the ending of Shakespeare in Love. And I just, I got a little bit, you say tongue tied, a little brain tied on that. I mean, that was and Harvey Weinstein, there he is, and you
You
just,
can't make it up.
yeah, from behind the curtain, there's always a Harvey Weinstein somewhere back there. And the Tom Stoppard trying to work with this script that had been written years before, and it was not historically accurate, but that had these elements of homoeroticism, right? And I remember when I saw it the first time, just thinking, this is just delightful. It's very Shakespearean and it's wonderfully adapted.
But they had to tweak it to become the mega hit that it became.
Yeah.
And Shakespeare's not easy to tweak because he had a wife and two surviving kids in Stratford. So how you throw him into a love story that ends without the stain of adultery was a nightmare for Tom Stoppard. And he just throw onto that cross-dressing and same-sex desire. And it takes a Tom Stoppard to cut that Gordian knot, oppose Harvey Weinstein's interventions for the most part, and give us that delightful movie. But underneath the veneer of that film is, as I try to describe, a lot of conflict, a lot of division, a lot of anger.
Well, there's also you're throwing that out to a fairly large community of Shakespearean purists who are going to be, from the very opening credits, they're going to look for stuff. And guess who?
Of course.
Guess who? There's one thing that bothers me about the movie, and the only thing, and I love everything else. The joke, and it's a fabulous joke about, I think it's Romeo and the Juliet, the pirate's daughter, is that they're working with a title like that. And now I know from my studies that Arthur Brooks brought out Romeos and Juliet, and that story appeared in William Painter's Palace of Pleasure with multiple editions afterwards, 30 years before Shakespeare was there. It could not have been anything but Juliet from a fine Italian family. Right?
And not Ethel, the pirate's daughter.
Ethel, that was it, not Juliet. Ethel, the pirate's daughter, which is so funny, but it just couldn't have been that. And it sort of promoted the myth of Shakespeare's creative consciousness and originality, which I push back against whenever I do whatever little article I do, because I find the creative energy in Shakespeare in the adaptation, in the brilliant adaptation, and the writing of speeches using that fodder, that just like we would say with Coppola and The Godfather, taking that source material and making it do something in another medium. I'm thrilled about that, probably more than somebody just dreaming up things. And Shakespeare did dream up things, but very, very faithful to certain sources that he knew would have popular appeal in that time. And it's just a small thing.
Well, one of the pleasures you have ahead for your this holiday season is Joel Coen of the Coen brothers has filmed Macbeth in black and white, and I've had a chance to see it at the New York Film Festival.
Oh no, you have?
I have, and I have a piece out this week in the New York Review of Books on it, and it's very brilliant. It's extraordinarily brilliant, and Shakespeareans are going to love this film. They'll probably have one or two questions about it, as we always do. Yeah. But
Denzel
yeah. Washington is Macbeth. Francis McDormand is Macbeth, and powerhouse performances from top to bottom. Yeah. And I think we'll be showing this to our students or our successors for decades to come.
Oh, I'm so happy when that happens, because that does give you such in teaching, and particularly my students are very good in English, but it's still a second language, and it's a second culture, and it's a second culture to native speakers, and to be able to help use films and show how directors, and in this case, one of the finest film directors, ever, and his brother also, and writers, to be able to use that to bridge those gaps, it makes everything click.
Well, you're gonna love it, and a lot of it is steeped in Kurosawa's Throne of Blood, so you can show the two films together. That'll be exciting.
Yeah, that's it. Well, I just wanted to comment a bit on the Trump part, and this proclivity at the Delacorte, and I think there was. I think it was also at the Delacorte where Obama was Julius Caesar earlier, and it was at the same theater, or it might have been
It
another.
was a different theater. There was a production of Julius Caesar in which an Obama lookalike was assassinated in New York City
Yeah,
about 6 months before the production that I advised, in which a Trump lookalike was assassinated in Central Park,
yeah,
to the chagrin and growing anger of those on the cultural right,
yeah,
who attacked the stage
yeah. They
and
disrupt
disrupted
performances,
production.
yeah,
Yeah.
in a scary way. And I'll let our viewers read about that in your book. But it's scary stuff. But you made the point in the book that they're not taking the whole picture of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar.
No,
You know, uh, Now I don't think either Obama or Trump exactly crossed the Rubicon and did, if we're going to be historically, or
I
follow
agree.
who is it, Plutarch, or Norse version of Plutarch, but still, all right, we're adapting it for a modern audience. We do have two iconic figures who are iconic in ways that George Bush and Bill Clinton even are not. Would not work. Obama
I
coming in,
agree. I agree. That's a very
and
good point.
and so there would be immediate jealousy. But what they missed is, of course, the fact of how swiftly Brutus and his gang were punished for what they did.
Yeah, it
It was
didn't
not
work
tolerated.
out.
Yeah, it didn't work
Um,
out.
but when I saw the events of last January on the attack on the Capitol, I really felt
Um,
that what I had witnessed at the Delacorte Theater at a production of Julius Caesar was a dress rehearsal.
yeah, yeah, surely was. But you did connect that with Astor Place and with how quickly people can get stirred up for whatever reasons, and how quickly theater still does that.
It does. It's
Uh,
true.
and the brand, I guess, the brand name Shakespeare, that can still get that
The blood flowing.
the blood flowing, and the right wing media, going in. Now, of course, Shakespeare now, I think, might be, because of the years of being taught in school, associated with uh, nerds, eggheads, intellectuals, left coast, right, blue states, coastal blue states, elites, that sort of thing, and that's very strong in right now. And I think that it may have been very strong in the mid 19th century, that kind of thinking. And I don't know where it comes from. I really
No,
don't.
nor I.
Yeah. You turn to this American theme. Now, your book, which is an anthology, is a series of cutouts from various influential people talking about Shakespeare in America. And that one interesting in itself, and wonderful reading for people who are historians or Shakespeareans also. You've been on this American thing for a bit here, and what was it always there? Did you turn to it?
No, I was probably sitting in the row behind you in London from matinee and evening performances. My connection with Shakespeare has always been with British theater, London theater,
Yeah.
Royal Shakespeare Company theater in Stratford upon Avon. And it's truly only been in the last half dozen years that I've turned to an American focus. I love Britain. I love theater in Britain. And that when I never studied Shakespeare at university. I had had a terrible experience with Shakespeare in high school and swore no one would ever force me to study Shakespeare again. And that's a not uncommon experience, but it's helped me reach readers who I know hated Shakespeare, even if they won't admit it. And when I was in my late teens, I traveled to Europe quite a bit, first with my big brother, then alone. And we ended up in London. And for, as you remember, for, just $1 or $2, you could get a student ticket to see a play and a matinee. And all of a sudden you were seeing 6 or 7 Shakespeare productions in a week. And I came back every year through my late teens and early 20s. And by then I'd seen, I don't know, a couple of hundred, maybe 250 productions. Only Shakespeare. People would offer me tickets to Nicholas Nickleby, which would be a huge hit. I'd say, no, I'm going to see my 4th comedy of error, comedy of errors instead.
Yeah.
And but that's a very formative time in one's life, as you know as well.
Yeah.
And those productions are tattooed in my head. And
Yeah.
that was my Shakespeare education. And I must have spent a lot of time napping during American history in high school because I don't remember a damn thing. So I've had to re-educate myself as an American citizen. And my next book is also going to be on an American subject with some Shakespeare in there as well.
Yeah. Oh, there's so many stories we could tell. We don't have time. One prominent one is that the Old Vic, when I was there, the Old Vic was about to go under, and it's on the wrong side of the river. Now it's kind of the right side of the river because that's
right.
all rejuvenated. And for £2, I had front row seats to a production of Chekhov's Ivanov. And
Wow.
I do go off Shakespeare, particularly if it's Chekhov or somebody like Beckett or, these great playwrights. And Ivanov is not a mainstream play. It's not, the Cherry Orchard. But I thought, my professor said, this is a portrayal of what was called then manic depressiveness, which we call now bipolar. And I got there and I watched, and the lead actor in that play just killed it. It was the best thing I think I've ever
Wow.
seen. It's just, one of those things that you go, God, and I'm front row. And his name was Derek Jacobi.
Wow.
And this was before,
Wow.
this was before I, Claudius, or any of the recognition. He was in this off play. And I went to the pub afterwards with my friend, and here he walked in. And, of course, I walked up and I said, Mr. Jacobi, I really enjoyed your performance. And he said, someone was in the audience.
But you are very lucky. But we are of an age, but it was an age where you could see, before the age of Netflix, where stars couldn't afford to do theater work. Their agents wouldn't let them.
Yeah.
We had a chance to see extraordinary, the best actors in the world perform in these plays. And for you and for me, obviously, for both of us, it was a transformative experience.
Yeah, it was. It did everything. It was almost a tragic transformation for me, but I managed to struggle through and get into a profession and a good job. A lot of people have trouble in the profession, but because of that, and this is the next topic that I find that my younger colleagues in the profession are very cautious now about what they say and do in papers, and they have to be. They have to fit into journals. They have to get their promotions. They're lucky to be where they are, and anything could destroy them. A colleague who doesn't like them kind of blackballs them in a tenure decision or a promotion decision and that kind of thing. We won't go into that, but it can be very, very ugly and mean. Not so much here in Japan, right? I would say in Japan, you would see something like that coming a long way off, whereas in the States, you might not even know. There might be an Iago right there who is smiling in your face, and So people are very cautious, and you are not cautious. I've never seen a bit of caution. Now, you started out with Johnson and rival playwrights, so you're already talking about conflict there. But getting into anti-Semitism, and in two books, because there's the Germantown, who I won't dare try to pronounce.
Rammergau.
Yes, that history there. And then the
Contested will, the authorship question.
Authorship question. My goodness, you said, just stand on stage middle with a big bullseye and say, "Here I am," because there are all those guys, those people out there, and they're absolutely relentless. There's nothing. Trolls are nothing new to us. There's nothing new to you. They've been there.
I'm their worst nightmare.
I'm good. Good.
After I published Contested Will, on the authorship question, I got a letter on Supreme Court stationery addressed to me at Columbia. And I thought, I didn't know they had jury duty for the Supreme Court. I can't do that. And I tore the envelope open, and it was from a Supreme Court justice recently retired. Noted that Shakespeare's signatures, the 6 signatures, are all wobbly, suggesting to him that Shakespeare was illiterate and didn't write the plays. And being combative Brooklyn guy that you obviously recognize in my work, I wrote back saying, "Dear Justice Stevens, I admire your extraordinary time on the Supreme Court. I noticed that your secretary typed this letter and also signed it for you. Extraordinary that you've gotten this far as an illiterate." And yeah, it was kind of brazen to do that. Just like
I'm sure he loved it. He must have loved that.
He wrote back the next day, and we corresponded for 6 months until I ghosted him, because the position he was advocating was an Oxfordian position that the Earl of Oxford, who was fiercely in the minds of his supporters anti-democratic, was the true author of Shakespeare's plays. And I said to Justice Stevens, or I wrote to him, and my correspondence with him is now at the Folger Library. I've donated it so others can mine this. But I just said, look, you can't celebrate American democracy and advocate a Shakespeare written by a deeply anti-democratic individual. Doesn't work. You can't do both. And he said, yes, I can. And I said, then this conversation's over.
How
Case
about that?
Closed.
How about that? That's how it ended. Yeah, it kind of
It did. He was a lovely man, but for me, being tenured means an obligation to. Nobody in his right mind or her right mind would spend 5 years researching as uninteresting a question as who wrote Shakespeare. We know who wrote Shakespeare. Yeah. We've seen the archival evidence. I've held it in my hands. But for me, that book was also about the rise of conspiracy thinking in America. Yeah. And anybody who reads the newspaper or goes online knows just how viral that has become in the decade since I wrote that book.
Yeah. Yeah. And it irritates me. I think, okay, let's say I'm going to be anti Hemingway. I'm just going to say Hemingway did not write anything Hemingway wrote. And yes, he did. Look, I mean, we knew he wasn't. Did you see him write? Did you actually see him write? And did you stand there in the room when he finished A Farewell to Arms and watch him take it to the publisher and then print it? It's that ridiculous that and yet they are out there, and I don't know what drives it, except it brings a lot of attention to the people who take a stance like that. And also there is a strong feeling that you had to go to Oxford or Cambridge to write poetry like that. And we did countless examples of people who don't have education.
Absolutely.
And as you were saying, I wasn't the best student in high school. And I managed at some point to get through and get into a pretty, good programs or whatever. But all of us have our histories of having to, you could say, listen, there's no way that James Shapiro wrote these books. He was born in Brooklyn to this, in this background. And there's no, way that this, a boy from a country crossroads could ever, have anything worthwhile to say about Shakespeare. That's a class thing, but you don't go to those schools. They don't sit you down and say, here's how to write a sonnet. That's the last thing they do.
In fact, I'm not James Shapiro. I'll fess up right now. James Shapiro is a reclusive scholar, and he hires me to do these. I've read his books, and he's hired me to do these interviews so that he can focus on his scholarship. But I'm happy to continue to answer your questions.
Yeah. Well, you said in one of your, I saw on YouTube that you didn't take Shakespeare in graduate school, that you were
That's
in
true.
comparative literature program. And I found that amazing.
I was definitely not going to study Shakespeare formally, and in fact, it allowed me to follow my own path. I also understood that if you hook yourself to a star professor, you end up in a lot of ways like a small tree overshadowed by a larger one that blocks out the light. And I couldn't risk that. I understood myself well enough to know that it would take a long time to shed that influence for better and for worse.
Yeah, that's so interesting that, yeah, and you took it up uh, after graduate school to go into this, and that explains what I find to be some of the uniqueness in your research methods, because when you do get into even your other the two books, The Year of Lear and the 1599, I can't imagine in the training I had, it would not have been easy to pass through the gauntlet of getting a dissertation approved, doing that type of thing. They would want me to do something. I don't want to, something else, but something that basically modeled the professors I studied under, and also very careful, meticulous, maybe textual, bibliographical scholarship. Maybe adopting some approved critics, whether it's Lacan or Foucault or something of that nature. And I saw that refreshing thing that you said, let's just go look at the year, and the records are there for all of us. And we are, after all, trained in historical research. So let's just put it together and see what happens. We've been talking about the past the whole time, and you have the future in your subtitle. So let's talk about the future. What's the future for Shakespeare in America, for us?
Well, one of the things that I do is work with a lot of really first-rate theater companies. It's a blessing, and it keeps me open to where things are going. And one of the productions that I'm talking with right now is a production of The Merchant of Venice
Mhm.
with an African American Shylock, John Douglas Thompson, one of the top Shakespeare actors in America. And it goes back to Ira Aldridge, who was a great Othello. We all know that.
Yeah.
But he was also a spectacular Shylock. So here we have 2 centuries later, an African American who in the New York theater is going to be playing Shylock. How that's going to land with Jewish groups and Black groups, I have no idea. But you know that I love conflict, and that's what this is about. I'm working with a Native American playwright who will be doing a Shakespeare production in the years to come. I'm working with Latinx directors. I'm working right now on a production of The Comedy of Errors that's going into prison, that is going to have some Spanish in it as well. So what I'm describing is a way in which a multicultural or pluralistic Shakespeare, or a Shakespeare that is not simply white and Anglo-Saxon, is now penetrating into the theater culture. And not simply in terms of scholarship on race, although Ayanna Thompson and others are leading that. But that is one of the futures for Shakespeare in America. That is to say, what does it mean to have Denzel Washington, one of our great, great, great actors, playing Macbeth, when Orson Welles and others have made films of Macbeth that didn't have a single Black actor? And Joel Coen has several in among the leads and also among the lesser roles. So it's a changing world we're living in, and Shakespeare is both reflecting those changes and helping to make them happen.
Yeah.
If not for Joe Papp at the Public Theater in the 1950s and 60s, giving a chance to every leading Latinx and Black actor of the day, we wouldn't have the Denzel Washingtons in the movie theaters today.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the things that's happening. The other thing that I'm turning to is the Federal Theater Project of the late 1930s, about which I knew very little, in which for a remarkable 4 years, there were hundreds, even thousands of productions around the United States paid for by the federal government under FDR and the New Deal. And until Philistines in Congress shut off the funding for this, we were on the verge of a national theater that would have made theater part of daily life in small communities and large. You could pay a nickel and see a play, much as we saw plays as students in London. And I guess having seen this plan take root in 1936 and then being uprooted in 1939 is for me one of the saddest chapters in my nation's history. And I'm spending the next few years delving into that and what happened then.
Yeah. Yeah. Funding the Philistines, it just doesn't seem to be any way to cross that bridge and get them to understand that you get a lot of bang for your buck. It doesn't cost that much. And when it's successful, it makes people money. If that's what you're worried about, money, it brings in.
Yeah, but they were afraid of too educated a populace, too open-minded a populace. That was what threatened the Philistines.
Really too educated a populace, like that's on the horizon. But well, you're going to Ireland. Is that okay to talk about? You're on
Sure,
yeah.
Sure.
And you're going to Ireland, and I'm very interested why Ireland. I think I have some idea maybe, but what a fabulous thing you have right in your near future, right after Christmas, right? Yeah.
Well, I've had to postpone it by a month because of COVID and restrictions in Ireland, but I've just rebooked successfully. And I'm married to an extraordinary writer who has Irish grandparents, all four, and one of her grandparents, her grandfather on her father's side, fought in the Irish Revolution, and she has accompanied me on many research trips, and now I'm accompanying her on her research trip. I'm a really good research assistant and driver, and I have many Irish friends. Colm Tobin is my colleague at Columbia, Paul Muldoon, Fintan O'Toole, and I feel a real affinity as a Brooklyn Jew with the Irish for some weird reason. I think they're confrontational as well after all the years battling the English. And I know I never would have written about Ireland in 1599 without having a strong interest in Irish culture and literature and music as well.
Yeah.
So I'm on sabbatical this spring, and happy to get out of plague-ridden New York.
Yeah. The Irish is here and there objects of genocidal rampages. I think there'd be some, cross identity there. But in terms of drama and theater, the history,
unmatched.
And just Abbey Theater, just to take a look into Yeats and that whole period. And I just sat on a dissertation as a second reader or whatnot, and the student was working on the arts and crafts movements in the 19th century in Ireland. And it's just fascinating stuff and how it connected with Yeats and with drama. There's a connection there. And of course, Beckett, and then O'Casey.
And Sing. I mean, they're just extraordinary. And many contemporary Irish playwrights as well. So no, I spend every night that I can in the theater in Ireland. And the last time I was over there, I saw a production of Midsummer Night's Dream that had the same cast as the production of Midsummer Night's Dream in 1977. And now they were all in their 70s and 80s. And it was
brilliant,
resituated in an old age home. Brilliant. And it was quite brilliant. And, all those randy slightly Alzheimer's patients. It
Yeah,
was brilliant. And it shows you these plays just keep on giving. They keep on
they really
showing new
do.
sides.
They really do. That is endless. Well, Jim, I have kept you through supper time.
And
And
I've kept you through breakfast, so we're equal
yeah,
here.
I might have. Well, I think I'll have another cup of coffee after we finish because I do have a class today, and I'll
Ah,
be doing that pretty soon. Uh, I I again want to express our deepest appreciation and our apologies. I don't know why we'd have to apologize. It's not our fault, but our apologies for not being able to bring you over. And but at least we can do this.
well, this was a
That's nice.
thrill, and I know our paths are going to cross in person once the world is back on its feet.
And I'm certain we'll just have to make it happen. And thank you so much, Jim, again.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking, and I'm sure we were in the theater at the same time and
Oh
same
yeah.
place some years back.